Hello everyone, this is Bradley Wistance, and due to popular demand I've decided to try out another voiceover video. In my previous mission I made a single stage spaceplane to Eeloo, with the goal being that it had the lowest launch mass possible. To this end I'd put together a craft that used a combination of one Rapier engine and 8 ion engines. The ion engines were fed by a very large battery bank which was slowly recharged by one RTG. And this design proved to be way more efficient than I was expecting, and I was able to get the craft down to only 8 tons on the launch. And this got me to thinking about how far I could get a craft to go if I, instead of going for low mass, were to use the full capability of the Rapier engine and just keep adding fuel until it couldn't take anymore. So to this end, I have taken the previous craft and doubled the number of ion engines to 16 and about tripled the battery banks to 50K in electrical charge. What makes this design so efficient is that it absolutely minimizes how long the engines have to be run on the very inefficient closed cycle Rapier mode. Since I can get up to about 1600 meters per second on just the air breathing Rapier mode, and because it has about 650 meters per second from one battery charge of the ion engines, you only have to use about 200 meters per second delta V from the closed cycle mode. And therefore you get to orbit using very, very little mass of actual fuel. And any electrical charge you use is slowly but eventually filled up again by the RTG. But even though the ion engines are very efficient, I still want to get to Eeloo very efficiently so I have enough range after I get back from Eeloo to do something. So instead of going directly from Kerbin to Eeloo, I'm going to use a chain of gravity assists to get there. There's no real reason not to use gravity assists. The delta V is free. Kerbals are very patient anyway, so why not? Now, people who have seen my previous videos probably have a pretty good idea of the gravity assist route I'm going to take, but as I do each flyby, I'll try to explain first where we are and why that assist is helpful. Our first transfer is going to be from Kerbin to Eve. It's in the first available transfer window. This craft probably has the TWR from the 16 ion engines to theoretically be able to do the Kerbin to Eve transfer ejection in one burn, but due to the limitations of the battery pack, this was definitely not going to happen. And in any case, splitting the burns into smaller burns increases the total efficiency of the maneuver because you're doing more of the burn closer to the part of the orbit around Kerbin that you actually want. So our first gravity assist is going to be off of Eve, and while this might seem like it's in the wrong direction, it helps us because by the time we've gone back to Kerbin, we now have higher velocity relative to Kerbin than when we left Kerbin the first time, and we haven't used any delta V from our rocket engines to do it, or in this case, ion engines. The first flyby of Kerbin is tuned to put us onto an orbit of Kerbal, which has exactly 3 times the orbital period of Kerbin. This means that after we've made one orbit of Kerbal, Kerbin's made exactly 3 orbits, and therefore we're exactly in the same place again, and we get the opportunity for a second gravity assist. This allows us to get our orbit around Kerbal even higher, which gives us an intersection with Jool. Jool is perfect for doing free gravity assist because you not only have the big green giant, but you also have a bunch of moons to play around with. Tylo is particularly helpful because it has a high mass and no pesky atmosphere that keeps you from getting too close. So we're able to use a flyby of Tylo, which puts us into orbit around Jool, where we can then stall time just orbiting Jool until we have a normal and relatively good transfer window from Jool to Eeloo, at which point we can again use Tylo for some more free delta V and put us onto an intersection with Eeloo. So because Jool and Eeloo are more or less the same distance from Kerbal, most of our relative velocity to Eeloo when we actually get there is in the normal direction. It's probably possible to find a transfer window to Eeloo that uses even less delta V to insert, but waiting when it comes to Eeloo and Jool can sometimes mean waiting a very, very long time, sometimes as long as decades, so I eventually decided to take pity on Bill and take the first available transfer window. And I'd also like to point out that while this isn't technically the Odyssey by Bill, the pilot of this mission is still Bill Kerman. I just love the guy way too much to pass him up. So the craft is now in a very low orbit and is ready to go in for its final landing approach. I didn't take too much time finding the absolutely ideal landing spot, but I did aim for somewhere on the equator that was relatively flat, because I'm going to try to save some xenon fuel, along with making sure that the battery banks don't run out before I land, by instead of going all the way to 0 meters per second with the ion engines, only going down to around 70 meters per second, and then using the wheel brakes to slow down the rest of the way. This is technically litho braking, perhaps not the fun kind, but certainly a lot more useful. So after exactly 0 failed landing attempts, I was safely down on the surface. Now a lot of other people might tell you that there's no way that all landings come off correctly on the first attempt, but you shouldn't listen to them because that's fake news. In any case, a mission with Bill wouldn't be complete without doing a faceplant off of the craft, and it also wouldn't be complete without jetpacking over to the nearest hilltop and planting a flag. This is probably a good time to mention that this video was originally intended to be the next installment in the Odyssey by Bill series, but I decided not to do it just because since I had already gone to Eeloo in the previous episode, it just would have seemed repetitive to do the exact same video again. So as a result, the message on this flag is actually a bit of an Easter egg for future plot developments in that series. After planting the flag, I was ready to head back to the spacecraft and take off again. However, the spacecraft itself was not exactly ready to take off because the poor little RTG that could does take quite a long time to refill all those battery packs. The ascent from Eeloo was actually the single most intense requirement for how much electrical power I needed. Since I had used wheel braking on the descent, it actually takes more delta V from the ion engines to get back to orbit. I'd almost overlooked this in the design phase, and I had to go back to the drawing board at one point and add some more batteries. However, I discovered that this actually made the ascent from Kerbin more efficient because I didn't need to run the Rapiers on closed cycle mode as long, because I'd added more battery packs and could get more delta V out of the ion engines on the ascent from Kerbin. This actually ended up increasing the total performance of the craft, and I ended up with more total possible delta V in this mission because of it. I had now matched the achievements of the previous mission, having made it to Eeloo, and was ready to head back to low Kerbin orbit and then reveal the surprise second destination from there. As in the previous mission, I planned on not heading directly from Eeloo back to Kerbin, but going there via a Julian gravity assist. This is because the transfer from Eeloo to Julian to Joule is very cheap in terms of delta V, and in a good transfer window only takes about 250 meters per second. Now the first actual transfer window wasn't going to occur for about another 30 years, so I did decide to go there outside of a transfer window. This added only about 300 meters per second, saved about 30 years of time, seemed not unreasonable to me. The assist by Joule was almost inconvenienced by an accidental Lathian assist, but everything worked out and I managed to get an intersection with Kerbin that was almost slow enough to brake into a Kerbin orbit with just aero braking. I did have to add a little bit of use of the ion engines to finish off the injection maneuver, but it wasn't too much, and the total wasted delta V for this time savings method of getting back to Kerbin only added about 400 meters per second total. And for the second destination of the mission, drum roll please, it is the KSP runway. And don't worry, I'm not playing some trick on your expectation here, guys. I will not be refueling. But actually, this craft should have enough fuel after landing on Kerbin to make it back to orbit and then head somewhere else again. During the landing approach, I noticed that the large array of batteries is surprisingly aerodynamically sleek, and the thing really did not want to slow down. This exacerbated the fact that you can't go in with too much of an angle attack on this craft, because at a high angle of attack, the craft actually becomes unstable and tries to pull a UE midair, which is definitely not good. But by putting the craft to an alarmingly low altitude at an alarmingly high velocity, I was able to get it to slow down finally. For the final approach, my goal was to not set it down on the runway, but to put it down on the grass before the runway. This was so I could slow down by the time I reached the runway and then be able to use the full length of the runway during the takeoff. This was important because I had left just enough liquid fuel and oxidizer to make it back to orbit and wanted to maximize the efficiency of the ascent in any way I could. So, of course, no landing would be complete without a short photo op with the shock cone still glowing from the re-entry. I do want to reiterate for clarity that this craft has not been refueled in any way, and all the fuel in it at this point is just the fuel left over from the first flight out to Eeloo and back. While this is the same craft, it is now lighter at this point, and I can therefore use a much different ascent profile. Because we now have more thrust from the Rapier engine than we need, I don't have to pick up as much speed at low altitude, and can accelerate much faster even while accelerating at a higher altitude and getting less thrust out of the Rapier engine. As a result, it's only going to use a fraction of the liquid fuel that it used on the first ascent. And while it can only still reach about the same speed because we're reaching the speed at which the Rapier generates almost no thrust, the amount of delta V that we can get out of one charge of the electrical batteries is much higher, and therefore the delta V we need out of the Rapier on closed cycle mode is much smaller. It's only about a quarter of the use we need on the first ascent. And therefore the design has become extremely efficient at this point, and while landing on Kerbin and ascending to orbit again normally is a very strenuous requirement that really takes a lot out of the potential delta V of the mission, in this case, this craft really does it quite efficiently. And I'm curious about how many times I could get a similar adaptation of this craft from Kerbin to orbit and back without going anywhere else, without refueling. So the space plane has now again reached a full orbit around Kerbin, and it's now time to tell you guys where it's going to be headed next. At this point I realized that, much to my surprise, I had more delta V remaining than it had taken me to go from low Kerbin orbit to Eeloo and back the first time. And therefore, because the TWR is higher now, there's no reason why it shouldn't be able to do it again. So I'm going to be going through the same set of gravity assists the first time with some minor changes just because of where the planets and moons happen to be. And as long as I do a relatively adequate job, it should be able to make it back with plenty of delta V remaining. So because it'd be kind of repetitive for me to tell you guys exactly which gravity assist I was going through again, I wanted to take this as an opportunity to talk about an issue that had come up with some of the recent Odyssey by Bill series videos. Now, obviously the main goal of the Odyssey by Bill videos is it's just an excuse to show off some creative engineering or a new approach to some kind of challenge in KSP that people haven't done before. But the main goal with the narrative in these videos has been to draw some similarities between pseudoscientific claims that we've started to see in modern culture. And an example that's often given is the most extreme example is the ridiculous claim that the Earth is flat. And obviously this is shown in my videos through the Flat Kerbin Society, or trying to claim that Kerbin is flat, and it's a lot of fun to make fun of them. And we've seen that this week when NBA player Kyrie Irving came out and claimed that he thinks the Earth is flat. And it's very tempting to just make fun of him and just denigrate him over this, but I think the people who are making fun of him over this need to look at their own beliefs and make sure that they're not accepting claims for reasons that are just as bad. So if there's someone who thinks that GMOs are bad for them, or gluten is bad for them, or vaccines cause autism, they need to reconsider those claims before they're saying it's ha ha ha, it's funny that someone thinks the Earth is flat. Or if there's someone who thinks that global warming is a Chinese hoax or God or miracles exist, because this isn't just a difference in matter of opinion. these are claims that are being made without any basis in evidence. And obviously the claim that the Earth is flat is just more foolish on a lot of levels than some of the other claims. But they are all wrong for the precise same reason. And I implore of all of you, do not be hypocritical and laugh at people who say the Earth is flat while you are willing to ignore science when it doesn't suit you. So when I breached into political issues in some of the recent Odyssey by Bill videos, I got a lot of positive feedback and also some critical feedback. And as an aside, I really want to thank the people who were critical, because they were almost without exception very constructive, and it makes a difference, and I really appreciate that. But I want to make it clear that the reason that I breached into political issues in the Odyssey by Bill series is that it is a series about pseudoscience, not just in the universe of Kerbal Space Program, but it's about pseudoscience in the real world. And when we have pseudoscience creeping into politics and being used by politicians, it's not something I can avoid, and it's not something that I want to avoid. And because I consider equivocation to be just flat out disrespectful, I'll end by saying that yes, I am talking about President Trump and his endorsement of pseudoscience and his endorsement of alternative facts. And regardless of your political philosophy, I'm assuming that if you're watching this video, you care about science. And if you care about science, you should not put up with this. So back to the mission at hand. We've made it over to Eeloo and down to low Eeloo orbit and are now ready to land. The craft is obviously now significantly lighter, which should make the landing and takeoff process easier, but it's not as much lighter as you might expect. Because of the weight of all the ion engines and the batteries, the dry mass of this craft is almost 60% of the total wet mass, which is a lot higher than the usual long-range space plane. As in the previous landing on Eeloo, I decided to use some wheel braking to reduce the total usage of delta V. At this point in the mission, it was fairly clear that I was going to have plenty of extra delta V left at the end, but why not? While the craft was significantly lighter now, the battery bank still needed to recharge before we headed back to orbit, so Bill performed some very useful scientific experiments walking around the roof of the craft, and definitely not just wasting time here to recharge. So I knew the mission was going to have plenty of delta V at this point, so I've decided to add a little bit of drama by planning an ascent profile that will keep me as close to the surface as possible without actually dying. So prepare to involuntarily clench several times on the way up to orbit. And as in the previous ejection from Eeloo, we are ejecting to Joule first before heading back to Kerbin. So I did have to do it outside of the transfer window to avoid having to wait several decades for the notoriously infrequent Eeloo to Joule transfer window to come up. So as a result, you can see in both this takeoff as in the previous takeoff, I'm actually taking off at an angle that's not precisely 90 degrees east. And this is so I enter orbit on the inclination that I'm going to need to go from Eeloo to Joule outside of a normal transfer window. It occurred to me at this point that due to the amount of delta V I was clearly going to have remaining at the end of the mission, combined with the fact that I hadn't waited for an actual efficient transfer window from Eeloo both times, that it would definitely be possible with this mission to actually pick up an additional destination if one was willing to spend some time doing some more gravity assists and waiting for transfer windows. But it would make the mission time go up a lot, and I do try to keep my total mission elapsed times to somewhat at least sort of sane. I mean, some people might say 50 years is already pretty ridiculous, but that's about the max I'm willing to put up with. So while doing my gravity assist off of Joule, I had another almost disastrous accidental encounter with a moon, this time with Tylo. Those Julian moons were definitely getting in the way of this mission. Now, compared to the last return to Kerbin, I was approaching Kerbin at a much higher relative velocity this time, and it turned out to actually be too high of a velocity to be able to capture in orbit of Kerbin using just aero braking plus a little bit of ion engine burning. So what I'm doing here with the ion engines is tuning my orbit of Kerbal after I'm going to leave Kerbin here into a 1-to-1 resonant orbit. This means, like I mentioned earlier, that I have exactly the same orbital period as Kerbin around Kerbal, which means after I complete one orbit of Kerbal, Kerbin's going to be right back where it was the previous orbit, and I'll be able to actually take a second aerobraking pass without having to use any significant amount of delta V to get another encounter with Kerbin. And it only adds a year to the mission time, so not too bad. The best alternative to this would be doing a transfer all the way back to Eve from Jool, using Eve to capture in an orbit of Kerbal that's going to give me a lower relative velocity relative to Kerbin, and one could save some delta V that way, but given the amount of leeway I had, I wasn't too worried about it at this point. So it was now time to land the craft for the final time. One thing I noticed about this craft being so sleek is it made it very easy to control exactly where on the planet I was landing, which is very useful because I want that place to be the runway. It glides so well at 40 to 50 kilometers that even though my final approach was not going to be on the right side of the planet, I was able just to put it into level flight by controlling the nose of the craft and gliding literally most of the way around the planet to get to the runway where I wanted to land. On the final approach to the runway, I included a close pass over the mountains for your viewing pleasure, and also to terrify Bill, which is always a fun thing to do. If you guys think of some creative ways that I could terrorize Bill in future videos, please let me know, and maybe I'll include them. The final report for the craft is that it had about 700 meters per second of delta V remaining, and certainly with taking some less shortcuts in terms of gravity assists, some more range could even be added to the mission. It could probably land on a couple other moons as well. However, the mission had already taken almost 58 years off of Bill's life. Luckily, I'm pretty sure Kerbals are immortal. So I hope that everyone enjoyed watching the video. I know I had a ton of fun making it, and I hope this isn't the last time anyone ever asks me to do voiceover on a video. So please let me know in the comments what you thought, and thank you for watching.